The fire had gone out sometime after midnight. Silas Kane knew it the way a man knows danger not by thinking, but by feeling. The cold did not creep in. It arrived all at once, pressing against his chest like a hand made of iron. He opened his eyes. The cabin was black. Wind screamed through the valley outside, shaking the walls so hard the timber groaned like something alive and in pain. Snow had been falling for 2 days straight, the kind of blizzard that buried the Montana Territory under white silence and made the world forget that anything human had ever lived there. January 1877, the coldest winter in a decade. Silas swung his legs off the cot and felt his bare feet hit the frozen floor. He moved to the hearth by memory alone, hands finding the iron poker, the dry kindling he kept stacked in the corner. His fingers were stiff. His breath came out in white clouds that vanished before they reached the ceiling. He struck a match. The small flame trembled in his hand, and in that brief orange glow he saw what the darkness had been hiding. Footprints. Wet, narrow footprints leading from the front door across the plank floor. They did not wander. They did not hesitate. They moved in a straight line from the door to the far wall, where his old cavalry blanket hung from a nail. Behind that blanket, something was breathing. Silas did not reach for his rifle. Not yet. He had lived alone in this valley for 3 years. No neighbors, no road, just a thin trail that disappeared under the first heavy snow and did not return until April. No one came here. No one even knew this cabin existed, or at least no one should have. But someone was here now. He lit the kindling. The fire caught slowly, throwing weak light across the room. Shadows stretched and pulled along the walls. He stood, took 2 quiet steps toward the blanket and pulled it aside. She was pressed against the wall like something cornered, not collapsed, not limp, pressed, the way a person presses their back to stone when they have been running and have finally found something solid enough to stop against. Her knees were drawn up. Her arms were wrapped around herself so tight her knuckles had gone white. In her right hand, held close against her ribs, was a knife, short blade, bone handle. The edge was dark with something that was not rust. Her hair was black and long, matted with ice and dried blood. Her skin was dark, weathered by sun and wind and something worse than weather. She wore a thin dress made of torn cotton and a man's wool coat 3 sizes too large, soaked through and frozen stiff at the shoulders. No shoes. Her feet were bare against the plank floor, and the skin on her toes had turned the color of ash. She was Apache. Her eyes opened, black and deep and absolutely still. She looked at him the way a hawk looks at the ground, watching, measuring, deciding whether what stood before her was a threat or simply another part of the landscape. She raised the knife. Not fast, not panicked. She raised it the way someone raises a tool they have used many times before, with calm, practiced certainty. Silas held up both hands, palms open. He did not step back. He did not step forward. "I am not going to hurt you," he said. She did not lower the knife. Her eyes moved from his face to his hands to the rifle hanging above the door, then back to his face. "The coat," she said. Her voice was barely there, scraped raw by cold and exhaustion. "On the shelf." Silas glanced at the shelf. His old cavalry uniform sat folded where it always sat, blue wool, brass buttons tarnished green. She had seen it. "I am not a soldier," he said, "not anymore." Her grip on the knife did not change, but something in her eyes shifted, not trust, something closer to calculation. Then her body made the decision her mind had been fighting. Her arm dropped. The knife slipped from her fingers and clattered against the floor. Her head tilted back against the wall and her eyes fluttered shut. She was not unconscious. She was simply too spent to hold on any longer. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. A thin line of blood ran from beneath the oversized coat, tracing down her wrist and dripping onto the floor in slow, steady drops. She was wounded, she was freezing, and she was dying. Silas did not ask himself whether he should help her. That question belonged to a man who still believed the world ran on reasons. He bent down and lifted her from the floor. She weighed almost nothing, but her body was rigid, locked tight by cold and pain. He carried her to the cot and laid her down. She did not open her eyes. She did not resist. As he pulled the frozen coat from her shoulders, a scent rose from the wool, faint, almost lost beneath the smell of blood and snow. Lavender, just a trace of it caught in the fibers. Silas stopped. His hands hovered over her shoulders and he did not move. Margaret used to smell like lavender. She had kept dried sprigs of it in the drawer with her letters, and the scent would cling to the paper and travel 1,000 miles through the army mail to reach him. He would press his nose to the pages and breathe in until his lungs ached. The last letter had smelled like that. The one about the tomatoes, 3 days before she died. He closed his eyes, just for a second. Then he opened them and the lavender was gone, replaced by the smell of blood and melting ice, and the woman on the cot was not Margaret. She was a stranger, and she needed help. He pulled every blanket he owned from the shelf and layered them over her. Then he fed the fire until the flames climbed high, and the cabin filled with heat that stung his skin. He boiled water in the iron pot and pressed a warm cloth to her neck, her wrists, her feet. Her toes were dark, frostbite. If she survived the night, she might still lose them. He turned his attention to the wound. Carefully, he opened the oversized coat. Beneath it, on her left side, just below the ribs, was a gash, not deep enough to reach the organs, but deep enough to bleed badly. The edges of the cut were clean. A knife wound. Someone had stabbed her, or she had been grazed in a fight, and she had been running ever since. He cleaned the wound with boiled water and packed it with strips torn from his only spare shirt. She flinched when the hot cloth touched the raw skin, but she did not cry out. Her jaw tightened. Her fingers curled into the blanket, but she made no sound. He worked for an hour, maybe 2. The blizzard did not let up. Snow piled against the door until it groaned under the weight. The world outside had become a white wall with no edges and no end. Sometime before dawn, her eyes opened again. She looked at the bandage on her side. She looked at the fire. She looked at him. "The knife," she said. Silas picked it up from the floor and set it on the edge of the cot within her reach. He did not know why he did it. A smarter man would have kept it. But something in the way she asked, not begging, not demanding, just stating what she needed, told him that the knife was not about him. She wrapped her fingers around the handle and placed it beneath the blanket, against her hip. Then she closed her eyes. 2 people in a small room, surrounded by a storm that could kill them both, and neither one said another word. That silence lasted until morning. When gray light crept through the frosted window, Silas checked her wounds again. Her breathing was stronger. The bleeding had stopped. Her skin had warmed, though not enough. He made broth from dried elk meat and held the cup to her lips. She drank slowly, her hands too weak to hold it steady. Her fingers brushed his wrist, and he noticed the scars for the first time. Thin white lines running across her knuckles, not cuts from work or thorns. These were deliberate, precise. Someone had drawn a blade across her hands with care and patience, the way a man carves initials into wood. He said nothing. She drank the broth and closed her eyes again. The blizzard held for 3 more days. On the second day, she sat up on her own. She looked around the cabin with those sharp, quiet eyes, taking in every detail the way a person memorizes a room they might need to escape from. The rifle above the door. The cavalry saddle in the corner, cracked and old. The tin plate and single cup on the shelf. The pile of books beside the cot, their spines worn soft. She saw the uniform again. She studied it longer this time, reading the insignia, the rank, the regiment marks. 4th Cavalry, she said, Fort Harlow. Silas was standing by the fire. He did not turn around. Arizona Territory, she continued, under Meade. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped from a height. Silas felt it in his chest. "Yes," he said. She did not speak again that day. On the third morning, Silas woke to find the cabin different. She was on her feet, moving. The wound on her side was still bandaged, and she favored her left when she turned, but she was upright and working. She had taken his iron pot off the hook, scrubbed it clean with snow and ash, and set it back over the fire with fresh water already starting to steam. The kindling box, which he kept half-stocked out of laziness, was full. She had broken the dry branches herself. He could see the fresh snap marks on the wood, and her hands were scratched from the bark. She looked at him when he sat up. No greeting, no explanation. "Your hinges are rusted," she said, nodding toward the cabin door. "The left one is about to break. The wind will take the door before the week is out." Silas looked at the door. She was right. He had noticed the sag months ago and done nothing about it. "I will fix it," he said. "I already started." She gestured toward the small workbench in the corner where she had laid out his tools, the hammer, the hand file, the tin of grease he used on the rifle. She had filed down the rust on the spare hinge pin and greased it. The work was neat and precise, done by hands that understood metal. Silas stared at the workbench. He had not asked for help. He had not expected it. She had simply looked at what was broken and started fixing it. "You should eat," he said. "I ate. There is broth left for you." He poured himself a cup and drank standing up, watching her move around the small cabin with a kind of focused efficiency that made the space feel different. Not smaller, more alive. As if the cabin had been holding its breath for 3 years and had just remembered how to exhale. That afternoon, the fever came. It hit her without warning. One moment she was sitting by the fire, restitching the torn seam of her dress with a bone needle she had pulled from somewhere inside her coat. The next she was shaking so hard the cot rattled against the wall. The needle fell from her fingers. Her skin burned under his hand. Sweat soaked through the blankets. Silas had seen fever take men on the plains. Strong men, soldiers who could ride 40 miles in a day and fight at the end of it. Fever did not care about strength. It came for everyone the same way, fast, mean, and without mercy. He cooled her with snow packed in cloth. He kept the fire high. He poured water into her mouth a sip at a time when she could no longer lift her head. Her body fought it the way she seemed to fight everything. Silently, with her jaw set, and her hands gripping the blanket like she was holding onto the edge of a cliff. At one point, she grabbed his arm. Her grip was shocking, iron-strong even through the fever. Her eyes were open but somewhere else entirely, seeing things the sickness had dragged up from deep inside her. She spoke, not in English, in ND, the language of her people, fast and broken and full of something that sounded like prayer and something that sounded like warning. Then she said one word in English, just one. "Mead." The name hit Silas like a rifle shot in a quiet canyon. He sat back in the chair. His hands were wet. His heart was slamming against his ribs. She did not say it again. The fever pulled her back under and she went still. But she said something else before the stillness took her. She said, "He is coming." Silas did not know if she meant the fever or a memory or something real. But the words settled into the cabin like cold air through a crack in the wall, and they did not leave. Captain Holly's Mead. Silas had not heard that name spoken aloud in 3 years. He had not allowed himself to think it. He had buried it the same way he had buried everything else from that life, deep, in dark ground, where it could not reach him. But now, in this frozen cabin at the edge of the world, a dying Apache woman had pulled it back into the light. And Silas sat in the dark, listening to the storm, and remembered everything he had spent 3 years trying to forget. Before Montana, before the cabin, before the silence, Silas Kane had been a soldier. He joined the cavalry at 19, the year after his father died of typhus in a one-room house outside of Omaha. There was no money left, no trade to inherit, no future waiting. The army offered all 3 in exchange for obedience, and at 19, obedience seemed like a small price. He was stationed at Fort Harlow in the Arizona Territory under the command of Captain Hollis Meade. Meade was the kind of officer men obeyed not out of respect, but out of a feeling they could not quite name. He was tall, clean-shaven, with pale gray eyes that never seemed to blink. He spoke softly. He smiled easily. He remembered every man's name, every man's wife, every man's weakness. And he was the most dangerous man Silas had ever stood near. Meade's orders were clear: patrol the territory, protect the settlers, remove the Apache. Remove, that was the word, not fight, not negotiate, remove, as if human beings were stones in a road that needed clearing. For 2 years, Silas followed those orders. He rode with his unit across the desert, through canyons the color of dried blood and dry riverbeds where the sand still held the shape of water that had not flowed in years. They burned camps. They drove families from land their people had lived on for longer than the United States had existed. Silas told himself it was necessary. That was easier than the truth. Then came the raid on Broken Creek. September 1873. Intelligence said a band of Apache warriors had been staging attacks on a mining settlement 12 miles south. Meade ordered a strike on their camp, a small village in a canyon where the creek bent around a stand of cottonwood trees. They rode in at dawn, 32 soldiers on horseback, moving through the canyon in 2 columns, the sound of hooves swallowed by the sand. What Silas saw when they crested the ridge was not a war camp. It was a village, small, maybe 40 people, cook fires still breathing thin smoke into the morning air, 2 women kneeling by the creek, scraping the inside of a deer hide stretched between wooden stakes. An old man sat cross-legged near the largest shelter, weaving something from yucca fiber, his hands moving in a rhythm so steady it looked like breathing. 3 children chased a dog between the shelters, their laughter carrying up the canyon walls and echoing back down like something the land itself was holding onto. One of the children was wearing a blue cavalry cap, too big for his head. It kept slipping over his eyes. He pushed it back and laughed every time it fell. Meade raised his hand. The column stopped. 32 men, silent on their horses, looking down at a village that did not know they were there. Meade turned in his saddle and smiled. It was a small, satisfied smile. The smile of a man who had already decided what would happen and was simply enjoying the last few seconds of the world not knowing yet. He gave the order. What happened next took 11 minutes. Silas knew because he counted. He counted every second because counting was the only thing that kept him from losing his mind. The soldiers swept down the ridge. Shelters were torn apart. The deer hide the women had been scraping was trampled into the mud. The old man with the yucca fiber was knocked sideways by a horse and did not get up. The boy in the cavalry cap ran 3 steps before a soldier grabbed him by the collar and threw him to the ground. Silas did not fire his weapon. He sat on his horse at the edge of the camp, his hands locked on the reins, and he watched. He watched a private named Greer drag a woman by her hair across the creek bed. He watched Sergeant Polk kick the old man a second time, then a third, for no reason at all. He watched smoke rise black against a sky so blue it looked painted. And then he saw the girl. She was small, maybe 8 years old, trapped beneath the frame of a collapsed shelter. 2 lodge poles had fallen across her legs, pinning her to the ground. She was screaming, not words, just sound, the raw noise of a child in pain who does not yet understand that pain can last. Fire was moving toward her. A cook fire had been kicked apart during the charge, and the dry grass was catching, flames crawling along the ground in a low orange line that was closing the distance between the fire and the girl 1 inch at a time. Silas did not think. He swung off his horse, crossed the burning ground in 4 strides, and grabbed the lodge poles. They were heavier than they looked. He pulled one off, then the other. The girl's legs were bloody but not broken. He lifted her and carried her to the edge of the camp, away from the smoke. Behind him, a woman was running toward them. Young, barely more than a girl herself, with blood streaming from a cut above her left eye. Her hands were reaching out. Her mouth was open, but no sound came out, as if the scream was too large for her body to release. Silas handed the child to her. Their eyes met for less than a second. In that second, he saw something he would never forget, not gratitude, not hatred, but recognition. The recognition of one human being looking at another and understanding, in the middle of destruction, that they were both real. The woman turned and ran. She disappeared into the cottonwoods at the far end of the canyon. The child pressed against her chest, and the trees swallowed them whole. Behind Silas, the boy in the cavalry cap was crying. The cap lay in the dirt, trampled. No one picked it up. That night Silas went to Meade's tent. He told the captain the village was not hostile, that the intelligence was wrong, that what they had done was a massacre, not a military action. Meade listened. He sat behind his field desk with his hands folded, his pale eyes steady, that same soft smile resting on his face like something painted there. "Every village is hostile, Corporal," he said. "You just have to wait long enough." Silas requested a transfer the next morning. Denied. He requested again. Denied again. On the third attempt, Meade called him to his tent after dark. "You saw Broken Creek," Meade said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. "That means you are either with me or you are a problem. And I do not keep problems, Corporal. I solve them." Silas understood exactly what that meant. He served out the remaining 5 months of his commission in silence. He did his duty. He kept his head down. And the day his papers came through, he walked out of Fort Harlow without looking back. He went north, then further north. He crossed into Montana territory and kept going until there were no roads, no towns, no people. He found the valley by accident, a narrow cut between two ridges where a creek ran clean and cold and the pines grew so thick they blocked the wind. He built the cabin with his own hands, felled the trees, notched the logs, laid the floor plank by plank. He did not build it to live. He built it to disappear. For 3 years it worked. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Silas woke in the chair to find her sitting up, her back against the wall, watching him. The fire had burned low. Gray light pressed against the frosted window. The storm had quieted, though the wind still moved through the valley in long, low gusts that shook snow from the pine branches. "Water," she said. Her voice was rough but clear. He brought the cup. She took it in both hands and drank all of it. She set it down. "My name is Kaya," she said. "You are the soldier from Broken Creek." Not a question. Silas felt the air tighten. "Yes," he said. "You pulled a girl from the fire." "Yes." She studied him with those black, unreadable eyes. "The girl was my daughter. Her name is Nailin. She was 8 years old." Silas lowered himself into the chair. The room tilted slightly, as if the floor had shifted beneath him. "I was the woman who took her from your arms," Kaya said. "I was bleeding from the head. You handed her to me and I ran into the trees." The memory broke open inside him, the young woman's reaching hands, the cut above her eye, that 1 second of locked eyes before she vanished. He had thought of her 1,000 times. He had never expected to see her again. "Nailin lived," Kaya said. "Because of what you did, my daughter lived." 2 words, but they hit harder than anything Silas had felt in 3 years, harder than the cold, harder than the silence, harder than the guilt that had followed him across 1,000 miles of empty land. She lived. Kaya did not smile. She did not soften. She told it the way a woman tells a fact she has carried so long it has become part of her bones. Then she said, "But I did not come here only to tell you that." If this story has already wrapped itself around your chest and is not letting go, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can meet again in more stories like this. And where are you watching from? I would love to hear your thoughts and where you are tuning in from. Before she could say more, Silas asked the question that had been pressing against the back of his teeth since the fever. You said the name Mead. In the fever, you said he is coming. Kaya's expression did not change. Mead is dead, she said, but what he built is still alive, and the man who is coming is not Mead. She told him about Perkins. After Broken Creek, Kaya ran with Nayland into the mountains. They found other survivors. 11 people, mostly women and children, moving north through the canyons, staying off the trails, eating what the land offered and going hungry when it did not. For 2 years they were free. They joined a small band of Chiricahua Apache living in the high country, far from the cavalry patrols. Nayland grew. She learned to set snares and tan hides. She laughed again. She stopped waking up screaming. Then Meade found them. He was no longer at Fort Harlow. He had been given a new command, a new territory, and new orders. This time, the soldiers did not burn the camp. They surrounded it at dawn and they took everyone alive. They brought the women and children to a place called Cedar Bend Industrial School. They cut our hair the first day, Kaya said. Her voice was flat, stripped of everything except the words themselves. They took our clothes. They gave us cotton dresses and leather shoes that did not fit. They told us our names were gone. I was given the name Catherine. Nayland was called Nancy. She paused. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind pushed against the cabin walls and snow slid from the roof with a soft, heavy sound. The schoolmaster was Perkins. He was a thin man with clean hands and a voice that never rose above a whisper. He believed that the fastest way to make an Apache child into a white child was pain. He was wrong. Pain does not teach. Pain only teaches silence. She told him about the beatings. Children locked in root cellars for speaking their language. Boys whose heads were held underwater in horse troughs until they stopped struggling. The razor across the knuckles, one cut for every word of N.D. Perkins heard spoken. He kept count in a ledger book. He was very precise. Then she told him about Dolly. There was a girl, Kaya said, 7 years old. She came from a camp near the Mogollon Rim. She had never seen a white person before they took her. Kaya's hands were resting on the blanket. They had been still until now. Dolly stopped eating after the first month. Perkins called it stubbornness. He ordered her food taken away entirely until she learned obedience. Kaya's voice did not break, but her hands changed. The fingers curled inward slowly and pressed against her palms until the tendons stood out like cords. She died on a Tuesday. A silence. I held her. Another silence, longer. The fire popped and sent a spark onto the hearthstone. She weighed nothing. Kaya's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. She weighed nothing at all, and her hands were. She stopped. Her jaw tightened. She looked away from Sila's, toward the frosted window, and for the first time since she had arrived in his cabin, her eyes were not steady. They were bright with something she was fighting, something that pressed behind them like water behind a dam. She did not cry. She pulled herself back the way a person pulls back from the edge of a drop, deliberately, with effort by choosing to. When she turned to face him again, her voice had returned to its flat, controlled register. But Sila's had seen the fracture. He had seen what it cost her to tell that story, and the telling was worse than any scar on her body because it was the one wound she could not wrap in cloth and wait for time to close. They buried her behind the school, Kaya said. In a grave with no marker, I put a stone on it. That is all I could do. She turned slightly, and the firelight caught her back through the thin dress. Long, raised welts crossing her shoulders and running down her spine like the rungs of a terrible ladder. Some of them were still pink, still healing. Whip, she said, for the second offense and every offense after. Silas felt something shift inside his chest. Not just anger, something structural, like a beam giving way in a house that had stood too long on a cracked foundation. How did you get out? He asked. Nayland got sick, fever, high and bad. Perkins would not send for a doctor. He said God would decide. I waited 2 days. On the second night, I broke a window with a chair leg and carried Nayland out. I walked 6 days through open country with no food and no shoes. We reached a mescalero camp south of the Gila River. They took us in. And Nayland recovered. She recovered. She is 12 now, strong, quiet like her father was. A pause, the fire popped, and a log settled in the hearth. She does not remember Broken Creek, Kaya said. I have made sure of that. Silas closed his eyes. The image came back, the small girl, the burning grass, the weight of the lodge poles in his hands. She was 12 now. She did not remember. But her mother remembered everything. Every village, every grave, every unmarked stone. She carried it all so that her daughter would not have to. Before I tell you the rest, Kaya said, you need to know that I was followed. The cabin went very still. A man, white, tall. He carries a long rifle and rides a gray horse. He has been tracking me for 11 days. I lost him in the storm 2 days ago, but he will find the trail again when the snow stops. Who is he? His name is Virgil Prout. He is a tracker. He works for Perkins. Silas did not know the name Perkins, but he knew the name Prout. Virgil Prout had scouted for the 4th Cavalry during Silas's second year at Fort Harlow. A quiet, patient man with a long memory and no conscience. The kind of man who tracked people the way other men tracked elk, without malice, without mercy, and without stopping. Why is Perkins sending a tracker after you? Silas asked. Because I escaped from his school, and because I took something with me when I left. She reached into the folds of her dress and her fingers closed around something, but she did not pull it out. Not yet. This comes last, she said. First, you need to understand what it means. She told him about Meade's death. 18 months ago, a group of Apache warriors ambushed a cavalry patrol near the Gila River. The patrol had been raiding camps, taking children for the reservation schools. The Apache fought back. The patrol was routed. Several soldiers were killed, including the commanding officer. The officer was tall, Kaya said, pale eyes, clean-shaven. Silas's hands went cold. His name was Meade. The cabin was very quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause. When the warriors searched his body, they found something in his breast pocket. Not in a saddlebag, not in a pack. In his pocket against his chest, as if it were something he kept close. She opened her hand. A locket. Small, oval, made of tarnished silver. The chain was broken. The clasp was scratched. But the locket itself was intact. Firelight caught its surface and sent a small, warm glow across Kaya's palm. Silas did not move. He did not breathe. He knew that locket the way a man knows his own heartbeat. He had bought it in a shop in Omaha the week before his wedding. A small shop on a side street, run by a German silversmith who told him the metal came from a mine in Colorado, and the clasp was made to last a lifetime. He had placed the locket around his wife's neck on the morning they were married, standing outside a small wooden church while the wind blew dust across the road, and the minister's wife played a hymn on a wheezing organ inside. Margaret. She had worn it every day. He had watched it catch the light against her skin 1,000 times. When she tilted her head to laugh, it swung forward and back. When she leaned over the stove, it hung free, and she would tuck it back inside her collar with one finger, a small, unconscious gesture that he had loved without ever telling her. She had died wearing it, or so he had believed. Where did you get this? His voice was barely a whisper. Kaya set the locket on the edge of the cot. It was on Meade's body. The warriors brought it back to camp. I opened it. Inside was a photograph of a woman with light hair and kind eyes, and on the back an engraving. Silas knew the engraving. He had chosen the words himself, standing in the German silversmith's shop while the man's steady hands carved each letter into the silver. For Margaret, until the trail ends. Kaya nodded slowly. I asked about the dead captain. They told me his name, Meade, Fort Harlow, 4th Cavalry. She looked at Silas. Your captain had your wife's locket. He had been carrying it since she died. The truth did not come like a blow. It came like the ground disappearing, slow and total, a falling that had no bottom. Meade killed Margaret. Not the Apache, not raiders, not strangers on a lonely road. The man Silas had served under. The man he had confronted after Broken Creek. The man who had looked at him with those pale, unblinking eyes and said, "I do not keep problems, I solve them." Margaret had known something. She must have heard something, seen something, learned something about what Meade was doing in the territory. She had lived near the fort. She had talked to other soldiers' wives. She had eyes that missed nothing and a conscience that could not look away. And Meade had solved the problem. Then he told Silas it was the Apache, a raiding party near the border, random violence, wrong place, wrong time. Silas had believed it. He had carried that belief for 3 years. He had let it harden inside him like a stone, and he had hated the wrong people, and he had hidden from a world that had already been stolen from him. He picked up the locket. His hands were shaking. He pressed his thumb against the clasp and it opened. The photograph inside was faded and water-stained, but Margaret's face was still there. Her eyes, her half-smile, the way she looked at the camera like she was about to say something kind and was just waiting for the right moment. He closed the locket and held it against his chest. He did not cry. He had gone somewhere beyond crying, a place where grief and rage and truth had all merged into a single white point of light that burned without flickering. "Why," he said, "why did you bring this to me? You could have kept it, thrown it in a river. It means nothing to you." Kaya looked at him for a long time. The fire cast warm light across her face, softening the sharp lines and the hollows beneath her cheekbones. "Because you pulled my daughter from the fire," she said, "and because you deserve to know who your enemy really was, and because I need your help." "What do you need?" "There is a territorial judge in Helena. His name is Whitfield. He has been asking questions about the reservation schools, the conditions, the deaths, the children who disappeared. He needs witnesses, people who saw what happened and are willing to say it under oath." She paused. "My word alone is not enough. The territory needs a soldier's testimony, a white man's word. That is how this world works. My word will not save those children. Yours might." The truth of it sat between them, ugly and plain. She was right, and they both knew it, and knowing it changed nothing about the ugliness of why it was true. "There are 200 children still behind those walls," Kaya said. Silas looked at the locket in his hand. Margaret's face, faded but present. She had believed the world should be better than it was. She had died because she refused to look away. He had been looking away for 3 years. Before he could answer, a sound came from outside, distant but distinct, the sharp crack of a branch breaking under weight, not the wind, not a falling limb, the sound of something stepping where it should not be. Kaya's head turned toward the window. Her hand found the knife instantly. "He is here," she said. Silas crossed the cabin in 2 strides and took the rifle from above the door. He checked the load. Full. He moved to the window and scraped frost from the glass with his thumbnail. The valley was white and still. Snow covered everything. The morning light was flat and gray, and the shadows under the pines were dark enough to hide anything. Then he saw it. Movement. 100 yards out at the tree line. A shape that was not a tree and not a shadow. A man on foot moving slowly along the edge of the forest. He carried a long rifle across his chest, and even at that distance, Silas could see the way he moved, patient, unhurried, reading the snow the way a preacher reads scripture. Virgil Prout. Silas stepped back from the window. "He does not know I am here," Kaya said. She was already on her feet, the knife in her hand, her body tense and low despite the wound in her side. "He is tracking my trail from 2 days ago. The snow has covered most of it, but Prout can read what other men cannot." "How long before he reaches the cabin?" "An hour, maybe less. He will circle first, Check for exits, count the horses." She paused. "He will see there is only one set of fresh tracks outside. Yours, he will know I am inside." Silas looked at the rifle in his hands. Then he looked at her. The knife, the bandaged wound, the bare feet, the steady eyes. She was not asking him to protect her. She was telling him what was coming and letting him decide. This was the moment. 3 years ago, Silas Kane had walked away from Fort Harlow and told himself he was done. Done with Meade. Done with the cavalry. Done with a world that asked men to choose between obedience and conscience and punished them either way. He had come to this valley to disappear. And disappearing meant not choosing, not acting, not standing between anyone and anything ever again. But there was a woman in his cabin with whip scars on her back and a dead man's locket in her hand. And outside, in the snow, a tracker was coming to drag her back to a place where children were beaten for speaking their own language and 7-year-old girls died on Tuesdays and were buried without names. Silas walked to the door. He unlatched it and stepped outside into the cold. The air hit him like a wall. His breath crystallized instantly. The snow was deep, up to his knees, and the silence was enormous, the kind of silence that makes a man's heartbeat sound like thunder. He stood in front of the cabin, the rifle held across his chest, and he waited. Prout saw him within minutes. The tracker stopped at the tree line 50 yards out. He did not raise his weapon. He stood perfectly still, his long rifle resting in the crook of his arm, his eyes fixed on Silas. For a long time, neither man moved. Then Prout called out, his voice carrying clear and flat across the snow. "Kane, Silas Kane, 4th Cavalry." Silas said nothing. "I remember you," Prout said. "Quiet one, kept to yourself, left before your hitch was up." "My hitch was up," Silas said. "I served my time." Prout tilted his head, the way a dog tilts when it hears a sound it cannot place. "There is an Apache woman in your cabin. She is wanted by the Cedar Bend Industrial School. I have been contracted to return her. She is not going back." A pause. Prout's eyes narrowed slightly. Not anger, calculation. "This is not your fight, Kane." "It was not my fight at Broken Creek either. I should have made it mine then." The words came out steady. Silas did not plan them. They simply arrived the way truth arrives when a man has been silent long enough. Prout studied him for a long moment. Then he shifted his rifle, not raising it, not aiming, just adjusting the weight the way a man does when he is thinking about what comes next. "Perkins pays well," Prout said. "You could walk away right now and no one would think less of you." "I would." Another silence. The wind moved through the valley, lifting snow from the tree branches in fine white curtains that caught the light and disappeared. Prout was a tracker, a professional. He was not a killer by nature, but he was a man who finished contracts. Silas knew that about him. He also knew that Prout was alone, far from anyone who might back him up, standing in deep snow in a valley he did not know, facing a man with a rifle who was not moving. The calculation was simple. Prout could fight or he could leave. Prout took a step forward. Silas felt his fingers settle against the trigger guard. Not the trigger, the guard close enough. Prout stopped. He looked at Silas's hands. He looked at the cabin behind him. He looked at the deep snow between them and the distance to the nearest tree. Then something shifted in his face. Not fear, something older. The look of a man who has just realized that the contract he took is going to cost more than he was paid. He lowered his rifle, not a surrender, a decision. "You are making a mistake, Kane," he said. "I have made worse." Prout stood there a moment longer. The wind moved between them. Snow lifted from the ground in thin, curling sheets. Then he turned and walked back into the trees. His footsteps crunched in the snow, growing fainter with each step. But just before the forest swallowed him, he stopped. He turned his head, not his body, just his head, and looked back at the cabin one last time. He held the look for 3 seconds, maybe 4, long enough for Silas to feel the weight of it, long enough to say, without words, that this was not finished. Then the trees took him, and the valley was silent again. Silas stood outside for another 10 minutes, his breath clouding the air, his eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. The snow was still. He went back inside. Kaya was standing by the window. She had watched the whole thing. She looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, not gratitude, not surprise, but something quieter. Acknowledgement. The recognition of a choice made, witnessed, and understood. "He will go to the nearest town," she said. "He will wire Perkins. They will send more men." "How long?" "2 weeks, maybe 3 if the snow holds." "Then we have 2 weeks." Kaya looked at him. "For what?" "Helena." They left 2 days later, after the wound in Kaya's side had closed enough to travel, and Silas had fashioned her a pair of boots from elk hide and wool packing. They were rough, ugly things, but they would hold against the snow. He packed what he could carry: food for 12 days, blankets, the rifle and 40 rounds. The locket went inside his coat, close to his chest. Before they left, Silas took the cavalry uniform from the shelf. He held it for a moment, the blue wool, the tarnished buttons, the weight of everything it represented. Then he set it on the fire. The cloth caught and burned. Brass buttons glowed orange before they fell into the ash. The cabin filled with the smell of burning wool and something older, the smell of a life being let go. He did not look back when they stepped outside. The journey to Helena took 9 days. They traveled through a world buried in white. Frozen rivers, pine forests so thick the sky became a narrow ribbon of gray between the treetops, mountain passes where the wind screamed through gaps in the rock, and the snow blew sideways so hard it felt like sand. Kaya led. Despite the wound, despite the makeshift boots, she moved through the wilderness with a certainty that Silas could not match. She read the land the way he read words, fluently, without effort, as if the terrain were speaking to her and she was simply listening. On the 3rd day, she stopped him at the edge of a frozen river. The ice looked solid. Snow covered it in a smooth, unbroken sheet. "Not here," she said. "It looks firm." "It looks firm because the snow is hiding the crack. The current underneath has been eating the ice from below for days. Feel the air." Silas held still. She was right. There was a faint dampness in the air above the river, barely perceptible, the kind of thing a man would miss if he were not paying attention with his whole body. She led him upstream 1/2 a mile to a place where the river narrowed between 2 boulders. The ice was thinner here, but the water beneath was shallow. She tested it with a long branch, tapping, listening, reading the sound the way a doctor reads a heartbeat. "Here," she said, "one at a time, move fast, do not stop." She went first. Quick, light steps, her weight shifting with each stride so that she never stayed in one place long enough for the ice to register the pressure. She reached the far bank and turned. Silas followed. He was heavier. Halfway across, the ice groaned beneath him, a deep, low sound that came from somewhere below the surface, like something waking up. He froze. "Do not stop," Kaya said. Her voice was firm but not loud. She was crouched on the bank, her hand extended toward him. 2 more steps, now. He moved. The ice cracked behind him, a sharp, splitting sound that chased his heels. His boot broke through on the last step, plunging into water so cold it felt like a blade driven through his ankle. Kaya caught his arm and pulled, her grip stronger than her frame should have allowed, and he came up onto the bank gasping, his legs soaked to the knee. She had him sitting by a fire within 10 minutes. She built it fast, with hands that moved through the work as if they had done it 10,000 times. Kindling arranged in a cone, birch bark shavings underneath. The first match struck and sheltered from the wind with her cupped palm. She pulled his boot off and packed his foot in warm cloth. She did not ask if he was all right. She simply fixed what was broken and moved on. That evening, while Kaya was building the linta for the night, Silas noticed her hands. The cold had split the skin along the scars on her knuckles. The cracks were raw and deep, opening each time she gripped a branch or bent her fingers around the cord she used to lash the frame. She had not said a word about it. She had not slowed down. Silas reached into his pack and pulled out the small tin of grease he carried for the rifle. He set it on the ground beside her, next to the pile of branches, and went back to tending the fire. He did not say anything. He did not look at her. A moment passed. Then he heard the quiet sound of the tin being opened. From the corner of his eye, he saw Kaya pause her work. She looked at the tin. She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the fire. She worked the grease into her hand slowly, pressing it into the cracks along her knuckles, turning her fingers in the firelight. When she was done, she closed the tin and set it back beside his pack, exactly where he could reach it. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. Something had passed between them that was too small for words and too important to miss. The simple act of one person noticing another person's pain and doing something quiet about it. On the fifth night, they made camp in a shallow cave at the base of a granite cliff. The wind could not reach them there, and the rock held the heat of the fire close. Kaya sat across from him, sharpening her knife on a flat stone she had found by the river, the sound of metal on rock filling the silence with a thin, steady rhythm. Silas asked her about Margaret. It surprised him that he wanted to. He had not spoken about his wife to another person in 3 years. But something about the cave, the fire, the rhythm of the knife, something made the words possible. He told her about the wedding in Omaha, the 2 years of letters while he was at Fort Harlow, the plans, a small ranch, a quiet life, children, her handwriting which was small and precise and somehow always smelled like lavender, even after traveling 1,000 miles through army mail. He told her about the last letter, the tomatoes. How Margaret had written that the garden was the first thing she had ever grown that was entirely her own, and that watching something live, because she had tended it, made her believe that the world was not as broken as it sometimes seemed. 3 days later, she was dead. She sounds brave, Kaya said. She was. Then honor her by being brave too. They sat in silence after that. The fire between them was small but steady, and the wind outside the cave mouth moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. For the first time in 3 years, the silence around Silas did not feel like punishment. It felt like the space between one breath and the next. Room to begin again. They reached Helena on a gray afternoon. The town was larger than Silas expected, brick buildings, wooden sidewalks, people moving through the streets with the hurried purpose of a place that believed in its own importance. Telegraph wires ran overhead. Smoke from a dozen chimneys thickened the winter air. Kaya led him to a small office on the far end of the main street. A sign on the door read, Judge Henry Whitfield, Territorial Court. She stopped outside. "This is where I leave you," she said. Silas turned. "You are not coming in. The judge needs a soldier's testimony, a white man's word. That is how this world works." She said it without bitterness. She said it the way a person states the weather. "My word alone will not save those children. Yours might." "Where will you go?" he asked. "South, back to Nayland. She is with the mescalero. She is safe, but she is waiting for me." Kaya reached out and touched the front of his coat, right where the locket rested against his chest. "Margaret wanted the world to be better," she said. "So do I. The difference is I am still alive to fight for it. And now so are you." She held his gaze for a long moment. Two people who had been strangers 6 days ago, who had been enemies by the logic of the world they lived in, standing on a wooden sidewalk in Helena, Montana, carrying the same truth between them. Then she turned and walked down the street. She did not look back. Her figure grew smaller against the gray sky, steady and upright despite everything, the scars, the wound, the miles, the years. She reached the edge of town and disappeared around a bend in the road. Silas stood alone outside the judge's office. The wind moved through the street, carrying the smell of wood smoke and horses, and something he had almost forgotten the shape of. Purpose. He opened the door and walked in. Judge Whitfield was a small man with wire spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He looked up from a desk buried in papers and studied Silas over the top of his glasses with the expression of a man who had learned to be cautious about strangers. "Can I help you?" the judge asked. Silas removed his hat. He placed it on the chair beside him. Then he reached into his coat and set the locket on the desk. "My name is Silas Kane," he said. "Former corporal, 4th Cavalry, Fort Harlow, Arizona Territory. I served under Captain Hollis Meade from 1871 to 1874. I was present at the raid on Broken Creek in September of 1873. I have direct knowledge that Captain Meade ordered the killing of unarmed Apache civilians, the illegal seizure of women and children, and the murder of my wife, Margaret Kane, to conceal his crimes." He paused. "I am also prepared to testify regarding the conditions at Cedar Bend Industrial School under the authority of Superintendent Perkins, based on first-hand accounts from survivors of that institution." He sat down. "I am here to testify, and I am not leaving until someone listens." The judge looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at the locket. Then he slowly, carefully, pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the stack beside him and dipped his pen in the ink. "Start from the beginning, Mr. Kane," he said, "and do not leave anything out." The testimony ran 47 pages. Silas did not spare himself. He named what he had done and what he had failed to do. He named Meade. He named every officer who had participated in the raid on Broken Creek. He described the school as Kaya had described it to him: the razor, the whip, the root cellars, the children locked away for speaking the only language they had ever known. When he came to Dolly, he told it exactly as Kaya had told it to him. The 7-year-old girl from the Mogollon Rim, the hunger, the refusal to eat that was not stubbornness but something Perkins could never have understood. The Tuesday she died, the grave behind the school with no marker, only a stone placed by a woman who had already lost more than one person should be asked to carry. Across the desk, Judge Whitfield's pen stopped moving. He removed his spectacles and set them on the paper. He pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose and sat very still for a moment, the way a man sits when something has reached past his profession and touched the part of him that is simply human. Then he put the spectacles back on, he picked up the pen, and he continued writing. The testimony did not end until the sun had moved across the floor and the lamp had to be lit. 3 months later, the Cedar Bend Industrial School was closed by territorial order. Perkins was arrested and charged with 11 counts of criminal cruelty. 14 children were returned to their families within the first week. The rest were placed under the care of a newly appointed territorial guardian who, for the first time in the history of the Montana Territory, was not a white man. Virgil Pruitt was never seen in the territory again. The newspapers called Silas a traitor. Some of them called him a hero. Most people did not know what to call him, which suited Silas fine. He had not done it for a name. He had done it because a woman with scars on her back and fire in her eyes had walked through a blizzard to remind him that silence is not the same thing as peace. He never went back to the cabin in the valley. There was nothing there for him anymore. The silence he had built around himself had been broken, and he found, to his quiet surprise, that he did not miss it. He settled in a small town north of Helena, took work as a carpenter, built things with his hands: fences, porches, shelves, the ordinary bones of ordinary lives. The locket stayed around his neck, Margaret's face, faded but present, resting against his heartbeat. 6 months after the trial, a letter arrived. No return address. The handwriting was unsteady, the ink smudged in places, as if written by a hand still learning the weight of a pen. It said, "Nayland asked about the man who pulled her from the fire. I told her he was someone who chose, when it mattered, not to look away. She wants you to know she is learning to read. Her first word was brave. I think Margaret would have liked that. K. Silas read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully and placed it beside the locket, close to his chest, where the things that mattered most were kept. Outside, the Montana wind moved through the pines. Spring was coming. The snow was melting, and somewhere in the distance, water was running downhill toward lower ground, the way it always does, finding the path forward even when the land tries to hold it back. Somewhere to the south, a 12-year-old girl was learning to read. Her first word was brave. And in a small town where no one knew his whole story, a man who had once tried to disappear from the world was learning, slowly and without apology, to live in it again. Not because the guilt was gone. It was not gone. It would never be gone. But because a woman who had survived worse than he could imagine had crossed a frozen mountain to show him that carrying guilt in silence does not honor the dead. Only the truth does. Only courage does. Only choosing when the moment comes. To be the kind of person a 12-year-old girl would call brave. The story you have been following contains many fictional elements recreated with the aid of artificial intelligence. Please listen with your own consideration and feelings. These fictional details are not intended to change history, but to evoke the spirit of the old Wild West, where people had to live amidst harsh conditions, make difficult choices, and accept the consequences. Through this story, I only hope to share some valuable lessons about courage, truth, and the difference between silence and peace, things that remain relevant even as time passes. If this story left something in your chest that will not let go, let me know with a number 1 in the comments. And if you would like to return for another tale, consider subscribing. I love you all, the esteemed audience of Wild West Tales.